Hey folks, my name is Chris, welcome to Hobbyshire, and today we're going to be making these bad boys. Modular terrain tiles for tabletop wargaming. This is my first time making them, and I'm going to take you through it with me step by step, showing you what went right and what went horribly wrong, along with the steps I took to fix that. And believe me, I made many mistakes and learned many things with this project. I'm very excited about this. It's my first ever YouTube video, so if you're watching this, thank you so much for taking the time to do so. Alright, let's make a cup of tea and then get started. The first items that we are going to need are some kind of base. I'm using XPS foam, but you can use whatever you like. It doesn't need to be textured later, and it will eventually be all covered over by various layers of different stuff. So if you don't want to use XPS, you don't have to. You can use EPS or cardboard, chipboard, or anything like that. I'm using XPS foam simply because I have it spare. You will also need some kind of measuring device. I'm using a ruler. You will need something like a pen or pencil to mark out your measurements, and finally you will need a decent utility knife with some fresh sharp blades. You can substitute and swap out any of this for whatever you prefer, but if you're interested in where I got my items, I'll pop it in the screen for you right now. The first step here is to mark out and cut your foam. These are experimental for me right now. So rather than making a bulk load of them, I'm just going to make 2 of each in 3 different sizes. I'll have 2 3" by 3" squares, 2 6" by 6" squares, and 2 that I'll just be making on an A4 size sheet of foam board that I bought from the range. They were very cheap, so I wanted to see if they were up to the task. When you're cutting your foam, try not to force it. You're not trying to get through your foam in one cut. The foam I'm using is 10mm thick, and I'm just making smooth, shallow cuts that take me around 2 or 3 cuts to actually get all the way through. If you try to force it, you're going to dull your blade quicker and potentially ruin your foam, leaving extremely messy edges behind. Personally, I would like to use a Proxon, but I don't have one and I can't afford one, so a utility knife is absolutely fine. Once I'm done with all the cutting, I give the edges a quick sand. I'm not trying to smooth it out, I'm just trying to get rid of all the loose bits and anything that might fall off or become a problem later. It was at this point I decided that I wanted to reinforce each base to protect against any potential warping further down the line. I used some basic chipboard that I bought from the works, and I just cut it to size with some snippy snips, or as the super posh people might call them, scissors. I'm going to glue it all together with some tacky glue. The brand I'm using is Hobbycraft's own brand. I have no idea how good it is, and this will be my first time using it, but it is a fraction of the price of Arlene's tacky glue that every crafter out there tells you to get. So if it's just as effective, it will definitely be my go-to tacky glue from now on. Just be careful with your choice, as I once used some unknown brand of tacky glue that I bought off Amazon for another project, and it severely warped the chipboard. I'm hoping this one won't do the same. When it was time to start gluing, I had way too much fun making pretty patterns and probably went overboard on how much glue I actually used. But just look at how fun this is. Whee! Once it was all done, I weighed it down with random items that I had nearby and made sure to do it with the foam side down so that the heavy stuff was pressing onto the chipboard rather than leaving marks on the foam itself. In this instance, that wouldn't be such a big deal, as like I said before, the foam will all be covered over in the end. But it's just good practice to do it this way so that it becomes habit for times when you do need the foam to be free of any damage. Once everything was dry, it was time to start placing the rocks. I didn't record making these as I had made them before I started working on this project, but for your information I used Woodland Scenics rock molds, which are awesome and well worth the investment in my opinion, and for the plaster I used Geek Gaming Scenics plaster. I've never used any Geek Gaming Scenics products before, and I didn't buy any of this stuff. It was all given to me by a friend who had bought it, hated it, and was going to throw it away. I chose to ignore his opinion on the brand, but this is where problems started to happen for me. Now, I'm not saying it's that particular brand responsible for all my problems. In fact, it was probably something I I myself did wrong. But I have done this particular process before with another brand of materials, and I've never had these issues that cropped up. So I don't know, but you'll see once we get there. I grabbed up the tacky glue again and started to stick down some random pieces of EPS foam to make higher levels and fill some spaces where I knew I wanted to place the rocks. And after gluing the foam in place, I reinforced it by sticking some cocktail sticks through it in various places. I was not careful with how I shaped the higher levels. These were not made for the purpose of giving armies higher ground or anything like that, but more of the point of making some line of sight blockers. So I didn't need to worry about any slopes being too steep or anything. With the tops of the cocktail sticks that were poking out, I just snipped them off using some snippety snip pliers. But please, for the love of God, make sure you use your other hand to hold on to the end as you snip them. I didn't do that at first, and I had spiked spears of wood flying all over the place like rockets. One of the pieces hit me in the cheek so close to my eye and I almost died. When it comes to sticking the rocks themselves in place, I could have used a glue gun or some caulking. Either of those work fine, though I prefer caulking when it comes to sticking stuff to foam as it dries really solid. But since I was covering this whole thing in Sculptor Mold anyway, or at least a different brand of Sculptor Mold called Modeling Compound by Geek Gaming Scenics, I decided to use the compound to glue the rocks in place too. This actually worked out really well in the end and made for a solid fusion once it had dried. I also put plenty of the compound all over the EPS foam that I'd just glued in place to start taking away the unnatural edges and begin forming some natural looking terrain rise. I did the same on the XPS foam too, with no particular pattern in mind other than to cover the area roughly. To me, and this is just my opinion, but completely flat ground, especially long stretches of ground, just looks unrealistic. Unless it's a football pitch or a human-shaped area of land, you just don't really get that in the wilderness. Wilderness is generally sloped with occasional potholes, rolling hills, and just a general waviness of off-angle skew to the land. So I wanted to make sure that these, when they're finished with all their soil and grass and stuff like that they still depict the kind of natural realistic look. This is where I hit a problem. I usually use actual Sculptor Mold, the brand. I'm familiar with how it works, how quickly it dries, and how thin to make it to extend or decrease that time. This compound, however, is not the Sculptor Mold brand. It's Geek Gaming Scenics. It's not their fault, not at all. It's mine for assuming it would work the same. It doesn't. It dries a lot quicker in my opinion, and by the time I had put all this compound in place, it had dried. The first ones were almost completely rock solid, and it made carving and chiseling them a pain in the bum bum. I should have worked on one base at a time, or at the very least tested this compound to see how it differed from Sculptor Mold. It's a rookie mistake on my part and I won't repeat it, but I didn't let it stop me. I still chiseled it as best I could, but it did take me a lot longer than it would have done if it had not dried so quickly. So the next step is to seal everything. I did add a couple of little pebbles around the mountains, mostly just to test out my new glue gun, but then I got to work mixing up a sealing base coat. For this we need some Mod Podge. You can swap this out for PVA if you want, but it won't be as good. People say it's the same, but it isn't. Mod Podge has some kind of varnish in it too, and maybe some kind of flow improver. Mod Podge is the best. It's expensive, yes, but it's worth it. You also need some kind of beaker or cup or whatever to pour it in. You know, if you've had Mod Podge in the past and you've got an empty tub, you can just use that. You'll need some kind of paintbrush. I just get the cheapest one I can find. You'll need some kind of mixer. I use a lollipop stick. And then you need some black acrylic, and for this one I also added some brown acrylic. You can use whatever brand of stuff you like, but again, for the sake of offering helpful information, I'll tell you that I got all of this from Hobbycraft, except for the plastic cup, which I got from Asda. Then it is just a case of adding some paint to the glue. Not too much. The Mod Podge should definitely take the lead in terms of volume. All the paint is doing is adding some colour so that I can see where I've painted and if I've missed any spots. Once you put the paint in, give it a really good thorough mix and make sure it's all blended together. Then you just need to apply this to everything except the rocks that you used the plaster to make. because we're going to do something called leopard spotting on that, and if you paint over it with a Mod Podge it will seal it and it'll be no good. Once that's done, just leave it all to dry. Don't get impatient, you want to make sure it is completely dry. I like to wait until the next day. That way I know that it's all sealed and set, and when I do anything else I'm not going to disturb it. Time to paint the rocks. Now this usually is my favourite part, and I was very excited to do this. However, remember earlier when I first showed you the rocks and I mentioned that the plaster I used led to disaster? Well, this is the start of it. Before I get into that though, let me quickly explain to those of you who don't know how leopard spot painting technique should work. Basically, plaster is very absorbent. So you take your colours such as greys and browns for the rock shades and greens, reds and blues to represent the minerals in the rock. Then you heavily dilute a few drops of these paints. You then splash it onto the rocks and let it trickle around on the plaster. Once that is dry, you go over it in a brown coat to merge all the colours together. Then after that is dry, you go over it in a black wash to finish it off. You can then add highlights or dry brushing of whites and off-white colours if you want, but that's optional. The final look, however, should be very realistic rocks. It's a simple technique once you know how to do it, but it has really good results. But this all depends on the willingness of the plaster to absorb the paint. That's the crucial step in this. Without that, it don't work. The paint is very diluted like a wash, and at first when you put it on, it's very strong, pigmented and ugly. But when it dries, the main pigment should have soaked into the plaster, causing the vibrancy to fade but still be present, as though you've added a tone to a miniature, etc., like Nuln Oil to one of your Warhammer figures. However, my problem was this plaster, for some reason that I just could not figure out, was completely paint proof. It had zero absorbency. It was as though the surface of the plaster had some kind of invisible film on it that stopped any of the paint from getting through and soaking into it. This meant once the paint had dried, none of it had been absorbed into the plaster, and instead it had all pooled and settled on the surface. You could literally chip the dried paint off the rocks and see that it hadn't even absorbed a millimetre into the plaster. The surface of the rocks didn't even feel like plaster all that much, to be honest. Definitely feels like there was some kind of protective film of some sort on it, or some kind of sealant in the actual casting plaster mix that has set at the bottom of the mould and sealed it. It turned out to be an ugly, horrendous disaster. I have no idea why it's done this. It's never happened to me before in all of the dozens of casting plasters that I've used. Now, like I said earlier, I can't say for sure that it was the Geek Gaming Scenics brand of casting plaster that caused this. All I know is this is the first time it has ever happened to me in all the times I've done this technique, and it's also the first time that I've ever used that particular brand of plaster. If you have any clue why the surface sealed like that, please let me know in the comments, because I am clueless on this matter and I'd love to learn what the problem is to make sure it doesn't happen again. Maybe it was something I've done wrong, I don't know. I always clean my mould, so my mould was fine. I mixed it exactly according to the measurements of the manufacturer's instructions. I'm clueless. I was clueless and frustrated. Maybe it was just a bad batch, the end of the product run, and there was something in the end of the production mix that I was unfortunate enough to get contaminating my batch. I don't know, but like I say, it was frustrating, daunting, and I almost gave up at that point, I'm not gonna lie. In the end, I just painted over all the rocks in black, and then I did layers of stippling and dry brushing, starting from just lighter than black to a really dark grey to a medium grey to a light grey, and then I highlighted with dry brushing of cream and white, and it came out alright. At the very end I did give it another black wash to make sure it had the crooks and crannies filled with shadow, and I rectified this situation. It is not the kind of rocks I wanted. I did want the leopard spot technique style rocks, but they still came out well, so I moved on rather than giving up. Going forward, it was time to begin layering the ground. All the areas that we had previously painted in the brown Mod Pod mix now needed soil, since, you know, they represent grassy field lands. Many people like to use actual soil for this, which they've dug up out of the garden. That's great and a very good realistic look, but personally I don't do that because you have to bake the soil in the oven, and I don't fancy sticking a load of mud in the oven and baking it right before I use that same oven to cook me dinner. I know it's completely fine and it is a great technique, but this is just down to personal preference and I don't like to do it. Instead, I use tile grout, and the one I'm using for this project is a chocolate coloured grout. Before tossing it on with a spoon, I watered down some PVA glue in a 50-50 mix with water and dabbed it all over the brown areas. Then, as you can see in the video, I just shake it on using the spoon. This is where all those sharp edges and uneven lumps from the modelling compound come into play. The grout makes them look more rounded but keeps the general shape, which is a nice touch of realism there, I think. I also go thicker in some areas and thinner in others, layering extra or less grout in random places to further add depth to the vision that we are creating. Once I've covered the entire area, I spray it down with iso alcohol and then use a pipette to drop a stronger mix of PVA and water on top of it. When you've done it all, it's really important that you give this ample time to set, otherwise it'll just crumble away when you touch it again. I left all these for 2 days and worked on a simpler project in the meantime by painting up a couple of miniatures. You can do whatever you like as long as you give it time to not just dry, but to completely set. Drying and setting are not the same, and just because it's dry doesn't mean it's set. I will say at this point in time though, I was really happy with seeing it finally starting to come together. I can already tell this was going to have amazing results in the end. Next step, flock it. For flock's sake, flock it all. I really love the flocking stage because it's when you start to see all your hard work paying off. The way I flock is with a 2-stage system, and each stage is 3 shades. The first stage is fine flock, and generally the first shade I use is the highlight shade. This is the brightest colours. In this particular mix I have a very bright colour from Nock and a very bright spring colour from Jarvis. I just mix them together in the tub. The next shade on the paper is the midtones, the main colours, and this is medium greens mixed together. The third shade is the shadows, and this is the darkest mix. Again, I usually get 2 or 3 really dark fine flocks and mix them together. So the second overall stage is the coarse flock. It's thicker and clumpier than the fine flock, so it really helps to add depth to some of the piece. It follows the exact same system as stage 1 with highlights, shadows and midtones. A thing to note here is that I've shown you them from lightest to dark on the paper, but when it comes to actually using them, I'll use the highlights first, then the shadows, and then the midtones are the last used. You'll see this in practice in a moment and better understand why. With all my flocks ready to go, the first thing I have to do is base the whole tile in glue. This is plain PVA glue with a touch of water. Not as much water as you would use if you were making a spray, for example, but just enough to make sure it was spread over the dried grout nice and smooth. I didn't use any particular measurement to make this mix, but if I had to take a guess, I would say probably around 80% glue and 20% water. I was able to cover this whole thing in PVA glue because they're quite small and I knew I would have plenty of drying time. But if you are using some kind of glue that dries super quick and you're working on a much larger scale, you're probably going to want to work in segments. When it comes down to laying the highlight flock, I focused on the areas that were out in the open. For example, I stayed away from the base of the rocks because those areas would have the rocks casting shadows over them, if that makes sense. I just wanted the areas where the beams of sunlight would touch directly from time to time. I also took into account areas where there might be extra thick grass. There would also be light shades of grass poking through from the bottom in those areas, just like in real life. Next comes the shadows, lining the base of the rocks and going in places where I believe direct sunlight wouldn't often touch. Also where I imagine there may be rabbit holes or nooks and crannies in the ground shape hiding darker areas to give the impression of depth. As you might have guessed by now, depth is something I find to be incredibly important when it comes to making terrain look realistic, believable, and appealing to the eye. The eye! Finally comes the mid-tone, pretty much covering the rest of the areas that haven't got flock on it yet. I didn't follow any particular volume of spread, it was all just random, with some places getting an extra amount and some places getting a less than average amount. Since we had spent the time putting the grout down, it didn't matter if I missed any spots because we had that realistic mud texture coming through from the bottom. Sorry. I also didn't try to avoid going over the top of the highlights and the shadows because that just helped to blend it all together nicely. And also, don't worry if at this stage you're thinking that the colours are just not blending right or that they're too different in shade. Like right now in the video you can see the highlights and the shadows really don't go all that well together. But a favourite saying of mine is trust the process, and honestly this just works in the long run, so try and do that. Try and trust the process and just keep going and you'll see it really comes together properly and how it should. With stage 1 complete, I sprayed the whole thing down in an ISO alcohol mix, about 30% ISO and 70% water. The ISO will just kinda tack all the flock down and also make all the layers of glue spread into every little bit of the tile. Then immediately after that, I sprayed it all down in a layer of PVA mix, which was the same ratio as the ISO. In hindsight, I do wish I had covered the rocks first because the PVA made them a bit shiny. It was no big deal, but it meant an extra step in the end to get rid of that glossy look. I'm also sure a couple of you are saying I went overboard with the glue right now, but I actually prefer it this way. Yes, it does get very wet, but I work carefully, and I think as long as you work carefully, that's fine. And doing it like this will ensure that further down the line, when it's all dry, the flock will be solid in place and not scrape off the first time I move a miniature across it. Another reason why I like to get it nice and wet is because some flocks, especially the Jarvis brand, tend to leak their colours once you soak it, and I wanted to make sure all the colours would leak and blend together. Then it was just a case of doing stage 2, which as I explained earlier was the coarse flock. I just spread that out the same way I did with a fine flock. I used the shadow coarse flock to sprinkle randomly over the shadow fine flock, and I didn't care if I got it on the other shades and so forth. Once all of the different coarse flocks were done, I then give it another spray with the PVA spray mix, but only over the areas where I had added the coarse flock. I then took this Wargaming Scenics blend called Pine Forest Ground Cover and began to just throw it on. I really liked this mix and I thought it added a nice touch. I tried to imagine where the grass would be worn away from either the natural elements, bad weather, or situations like being trampled or eaten by various creatures that might live in this wilderness. Just areas where it would look more muddy than it would grassy, but not quite muddy enough to cause big sloppy puddles, and I think this mix really works well to do that. And just in case it's not obvious to anyone, I haven't let any of this dry. I'm continuing to work while it's all still nice and wet because like I said, I want all those layers of glue to come together and dry solid. So of course once I got all this mix where I wanted it, I gave it another spray of ISO and another spray of the glue mix. Now at this point in time, I did let it dry a bit. I had all the light stuff and the airy stuff put down. I was about to start working on some heavier stuff and I didn't want that to push away any of the flock or make holes or dents and stuff, so I did let it dry, not completely, but until it was really thick and tacky, and then I got ready for the next step. As you might have guessed by now, I'm a big fan of splitting the process of whatever I'm working on into steps. I think it's efficient and it helps you to stay focused without becoming overwhelmed. This stage is no different, it's a 5-step system. Step 1, I make a thick mix of PVA glue and water. It's about 60-40, too thick for a spray bottle, it would just bung up the nozzle. So I use a pipette to put it on all the tiles wherever I'm planning to add rock and rubble. Step 2, I lay the base of where the rubble is going. This is just something to change the ground texture. After all, grass wouldn't grow all that comfortably beneath a pile of rocks. So I went with a forest path mix from Wargaming Scenics. It's a great mix for sure. I usually make my own, which is very similar to this, so having some of this on hand saves me time. Step 3, I add some cork dust, for 2 reasons. 1, because it will add some variety to the colour tone of the forest mix, and 2, because I had some, and I've never had any use for this before, so I thought, why not? Step 4 comes the rubble and the rocks. This is just a mix of different sized little pebbles filtered out of sharp sand from B&Q, along with other leftover bits from past projects that have been just thrown into the tub. Step 5, pipette more glue on top after spraying with some ISO, and that's this stage completely done. As an optional step 6, you could add a black wash all over the rubble that you've just placed down, if you wanted, that is. I mean, it would help it blend with your cliff face a little better, but that's totally up to you. Once all this was finished though, I put these aside for 3 days to dry. I really needed every aspect of it to be completely sealed and dry, because the next step after this is going to be static grass. And if any of this was even remotely tacky still, it would mess up all the static grass and I'd just get it everywhere. So put it aside, work on another project for a while. I spent a couple of days binging Netflix and painting some minis, but you do you. Just make sure you don't try and add your static grass while this is still wet, especially if you're planning on being picky on where the grass goes, because it will literally just go everywhere and it'll be a pain in the bum to get off. Static grass time, which means the finish line is in sight, and yep, you've guessed it, this stage works in steps. I have a variety of different coloured grass that I'm going to use, because overall, no matter what you are doing, if you always use one flat colour, it's going to look, well, flat. The first grass is Woodland Scenics 4mm straw, strictly because I really like the colour tone and I think it will represent undergrowth nicely. I'll mix in some 2mm autumn to add to the variety of length and shade. This will make up the first layer of grass that I will put down. It will mostly be the straw though. The second step will be a mix of Woodland Scenics 4mm green, which I find to be a nice base colour for most areas of grass. To that I will mix in some 4mm dark green just to add some shadow effect to it. The third step will be a mix of 6mm straw by Pecco. I'm not sure if I've pronounced that correctly because I've never heard of this brand. I just couldn't find 6mm anywhere else at the time of purchase. To this I will add 7mm light green by Woodland Scenics. To me personally, Woodland Scenics and Nock are the two best brands in the world when it comes to static grass specifically. I'm going to add some spring green from Geek Gaming Scenics because I got it for free from a friend who didn't like the brand, as I mentioned before in the video. I also got a bunch of sample freebies included with my static grass applicator by Warworld Scenics, so I'm going to toss them in too just to use them up. My process for doing this is actually quite simple. I get some glue, this is tacky glue, it's not diluted in any way, and then I just use a brush to dab it on in the areas where I want this yellowy grass to be. Now, I'm not trying to cover the whole thing, I don't need to because I've put the flock down, but even for the yellow grass, I'm not putting it everywhere that static grass is growing. This is going to represent the thicker undergrowth areas, and most of it's going to be covered up, it's just you're going to see that shade poking through the rest of the static grass. So I dab all the glue where I want it to, and then I get the first layers of grass, which is the yellow straw mostly, and I place it in with my hands. I don't use the static applicator with this at all. I just sprinkle it where I've put the glue, and then I'll dab it down with a makeup brush just to press it into place, and that's the first bit done. Now the second step is with the medium greens and that mix of dark green that I showed you. I'm putting this down with the same amount of glue, just watered down a bit more, and I'm using the pipette, and I'm just doing it around the areas where I've put most of the straw and yellow grass. The yellow grass is going to indicate the thicker growths, and this is indicating the main body areas. There's going to be the third layer added to it, which will bring it all together, but for now I just want to cover the main areas where I'm planning to have grass. I use the static applicator for this. It's my first time using the static applicator, and for some reason that I just couldn't figure out, sometimes it would work perfectly, the grass would come out stood up. Other times it would come out laid flat as if it was turned off. It was a brand new Duracell battery, so I have no idea what was going on. Don't know whether I got a faulty static applicator. Don't know whether I was doing something wrong. I was making sure to touch the base with a crocodile clip. It just seemed to work on-off sporadically whenever it wanted to, but I kept going because I wasn't so much bothered. This is a new thing for me, the applicator, and before this I was mainly using just my hands, so I'm used to the grass not all standing up anyway, so it was still a big improvement to my projects, and I was very happy with how it came out. And I just kept doing this with the main body of grass everywhere I wanted it to go, making sure not to cover up the entire tile because we put all that work into the flocking and the rubble and the undergrowth. I didn't want to undo that. I was just trying to add some depth to the grass, and I think it worked really well. I know at this point you might be thinking, well, this looks hideous, it's not working, especially yellow patches, they stand out, but just trust the process, keep going, and you will see it really does work nicely. And the third step just follows the exact same process. I pipette the glue where I want to put static grass down, and then I use the applicator to put it in place. The only difference with this stage is instead of going around the grass that I've already put down, I'm randomly blobbing it on top of the grass that I've put down to kind of blend the two different colours together. I am putting some around the edges, but mostly this layer is to represent the taller grass that's grown because it hasn't been trampled on or anything, so it's got a bit higher than the other grass. And I'm just using it as a blend. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing this though is I've left my glue quite thick even though I've watered it down to use the pipette. The more you water it down, the thinner the glue will be, and the more it will spread, covering a wider area. So when you do go to put down the static grass, it's going to stick to a wider area. I like to keep it thick like this so I can be more accurate in exactly where the glue is going to settle and exactly where the static grass is going to go. My final tip in regards to static grass is don't be afraid to go overboard. I put way too much on, but that's because I want to make sure to cover every bit of glue that I did put there. After I'm done, as you can see on the screen, there's a piece of paper to the side. I just tip over the tile, tap it, and get all the excess caught on there. It's better to go overboard than underboard so that you can take off the excess and have a plush green grass rather than not putting down enough and it looking like a scarce, barren, apocalyptic land. If you do find that you didn't put enough on, there is absolutely nothing wrong with going back with a second run over. Sometimes I go over, do a layer, let all the grass get in place where it does, then I'll tip it over, tap off the excess grass, and do another layer. I won't add more glue, but I'll still do another layer to try and catch any bits of glue that I did initially miss. Time for some finishing touches. I'm going to use this matte scenic sealant spray to spray on top of the grass. I don't know if it's any good, never used it before. Then I'm going to use these leaves. They're from Knock, I believe. They're like little tiny leaves. I got 3 packets in different shades. And then I got a heather mix, which I don't know where these came from, I can't remember. But basically I'm just going to spray it in areas where I want to put down the leaves. It also seals in the static grass, which is the primary purpose of me doing this. But I also want to add these leaves, but not in the sense of representing fallen leaves. I want them to be leaves of little weeds and bramble plants and heather plants and other kind of things that are just growing in the grass, little bushes kind of. And once I sprinkle it wherever I want it, I will go over the top and sprinkle it with some of the heather mix just to represent a few little tiny flowers on it. I think it'll work really well. After doing this, we're going to add some more little details, but we're pretty much done, guys. This is pretty much it. We've got a few tiny little steps to go, and I can't wait to have this finished. This has been a massively long project, and it's really paid off. I really doubted myself in many areas and many stages of this. Back when the rocks weren't going right, back when the grout took a lot longer than I thought to dry. It's really come a lot better than I thought it would, and I'm very glad with how it's looking so far. So I get some clump foliage. Now usually I'd add different shades of this, but I only had the one shade, but it doesn't matter. I'm just scattering it around and putting it in some random places, not only to add that depth that I'm always going on about, but just to change the shades of the grass. You go from the little bushes that I've made with the knock leaves to these dark shrubbery spongy like bushes that I can do with the clump foliage. On top of that, I used some random tufts. I haven't got that many at this point. I've only got 2 or 3 different ones, including some nice pretty yellow flowers, but I randomly put some of them around just to break up the area and add a bit more of different colour styles to the tiles. And then once it's all done exactly how I want it, and I don't want to add anything else because it's best to leave this stage to last, I then get this spray, and it's a matte varnish sealant spray, but it's water based, so it's not going to melt anything, it's not going to frost anything over, and I would still suggest doing it outside because it is still a spray can, but I didn't record that because I did take it outside and my camera is situated at my desk. But I gave it 1 spray down and then I let it completely dry so it wasn't sticky anymore, and then I gave it a 2nd spray down just to really wedge in that sealant and make sure it was nice and sturdy. Knowing that I can take miniatures and use this tile and miniatures won't rip up the ground or foliage at first use is really reassuring, so I always think it's definitely worth it when you're done with any project to seal it in with some kind of matte varnish or gloss varnish if that's what you want, but I prefer matte varnish. And that's it, folks, we are done. This project is finished. It's now time for an epic montage with even more epic music. Let's go! Do 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 do, look at my awesome dungeon tiles! How great do they look, folks? I'm so pleased with how they turned out, because we have to admit collectively that it was touch and go a few times there, don't we? But these have turned out amazing. These were experimental, so I only made a couple of each sizes, but now that I know how they worked out, I'll be making a dozen of each size ready for some epic Warhammer battles later on. Before I wrap this up though, I want to share a few lessons that I have learned and some things I would do differently. First thing, whenever you switch brands for something important like plaster, Sculptamold or resin, etc., make sure you run a test beforehand. Don't use something for the first time on a big project that you've never tested before. Always test your new products on something that you don't mind destroying, because those cliff faces back there nearly made me quit this whole thing. It was such a rookie mistake on my part not to have tested the product first to learn how it worked differently. Next thing, when working with grout, it gets super messy. As you saw in the video, I had it everywhere. Later on with the flock, I wisened up and learned to put something better underneath my projects. An oven tray is great for catching all the mess, and from now on I'll utilise that. Another thing I learned that is often overlooked is to take breaks. It's so easy to get swallowed up in a project, especially when you are loving what you are doing, but please remember to take breaks. Get up and stretch your legs and your back, walk around for a bit and get that blood pumping again. Some of these moments I was sat at my desk for hours, and when I got up I was so stiff and sore. So take breaks, folks, and stay healthy. Anyway, this was my first ever YouTube video, and I'm sure you've seen stuff that hasn't quite worked well in terms of the filming and editing. So if you have any tips as I learn to do all this YouTube video making stuff, make sure to leave a comment and let me know, as I'm eager to improve for you. Also, at the time of making this video, I am sitting at 0 subscribers. None. Not a single one. So I would really appreciate any of you who want to subscribe and support me, just to show me that all this wasn't for nothing and that I'm appreciated. Thanks, folks. This project was so fun to make. I've made things in the past, but the feeling of making it on film to share with you all just felt like such a journey. And I'm glad those of you who are still here got to see it. The next project though is going to be even better, so make sure you don't miss that one. Now I'm going to go make a well-earned cup of tea, so I'll catch you later, folks. Toodaloo!